Good day, ladies and gentlemen. E-invoicing is on everyone's lips, and we at Puncto offer you solutions for both incoming and outgoing invoice processing. This means we provide options for reading and interpreting a wide variety of incoming formats and sending them into your workflow, as well as for the outgoing side, where together with our partners EPO and EcoZeo, you can provide your customers with different target formats. Take a look at it. It's really very, very exciting and truly very simple. First of all, just a very brief introduction to inPuncto, but really just very brief. Most of you already know us and use our products, so I want to keep this very short. Then I would like to briefly highlight the differences, specifically the relevant differences with this e-invoicing, what is usually meant by it, and briefly show the various forms. Then we'll have a live demo where we take a look at the incoming side accordingly. And what's completely new and really very interesting is also the outgoing invoice side. That means, for example, if you are in contact with authorities, then here in Germany, for instance, you will have to create what is called an XRechnung starting next year. And I would also like to show you how this works and how we can offer it. First of all, regarding document-oriented topics on the incoming side in terms of inPuncto, on the processing side, workflow, office integration, scanning, various topics, all revolving around SAP. That is the main focus, and it also cuts across the SAP system. So we actually always supplement the SAP system with these functionalities that may not be optimally developed there. We cover archiving topics, document capture topics of all kinds, once the data is in the system. Do we work together with Zalaris in the area of electronic files? And of course, process topics and inbound processing are also covered accordingly. By now, and we are of course a bit proud of this, we are active in 19 countries with our solutions and have over 100,000 users and more than 700 international companies. So that should suffice for now with the colorful pictures. I would like to briefly touch on the fundamental differences between the invoice formats here. What if we now, in everyday language, we generally say we are now doing e-invoicing. But what do we actually mean by that? By that, one aspect, of course, is that everything we can represent digitally, for example, an invoice as a PDF that we then send by email, is in principle already a certain form of e-invoicing, of digitalization. Of course, it's a PDF, which we still have to look into, and where we then have to use an OCR process to identify what invoice contents are actually there. There is no structured information in it. Inside, we basically have to process it as if it were scanned. It's essentially exactly the same processing issue. That means if we receive a plain PDF here, for example, from suppliers, then we can process it using OCR, for instance. We can extract the data and then start the process in the SAP workflow accordingly. There are also a wide variety of distinct topics and use cases to explore here. For example, one very common and practical scenario that we often encounter is that we have an electronic mail message serving as the primary carrier element with several different invoice PDFs attached to it. That is possible, for example. It is also possible, for example, that we have an email with a PDF that is an invoice PDF and various attachments. That is also possible. And of course, we can also say that we take the entire email and include it in the process so that it can later be archived as well. That has also, of course, been implemented. So the next topic is, of course, a pure XML file. Let's go a bit further with the pure XML. So what exactly is pure XML? An IDOC or EDIFACT invoice is, for example, the X invoice, which is now required by the federal government. So if you issue invoices to the federal government for any facilities, goods or services starting next year, for example, then they will only accept XML, not a PDF, so not even a hybrid format where a PDF is included, but strictly pure XML and this form of invoice. Of course, we have to provide this accordingly on both the incoming and outgoing sides. These are various things that we already have in place, which we have implemented with our customers. Pure XML, for example, Finvoice or the X invoice, or IDOC based on XML, EDIFACT based on XML. These are topics that we naturally process on the incoming side accordingly. The outgoing side is the same, but that will come at a later point. This is pure XML with no image information. There is generally always the question of how we can visualize this. There are different answers to this visualization. For example, if you want it to be visualized in a certain way within the process. We offer a very simple representation with 20 invoice relevant items, but there are also other more advanced XML viewers, so to speak. These can also visualize more extensive data accordingly. So that would be pure visualization, but that's not the main thing. The main thing is the XML. And in the end, that also has to be linked to the invoice or to the invoice document. The next topic is XML plus PDF. What is that? So for example, we now have two files. The first component is actually the highly structured information, which exists purely in the specific form of XML data. And in addition to that, we might also have another separate file with the exact same name and the PDF extension, so that we have a visual image representation available here for our reference. But these are two separate files. A pair is always provided. And that's how, for example, the 6-pay net invoice, the post-finance invoice, or perhaps also the factura work, they always provide such a pair accordingly. With factura, there are different variations, but we have experienced it, for example, with our customers, that they provide a pair, and this pair has the same name, so Hugo.xml and Hugo.pdf. These are, for example, ways in which the supplier gets in touch with you. Then there are the so-called hybrid formats. These hybrid formats, for example, take a PDF and embed an object into it, such as an XML file. We can take a quick look at that later. For example, this is the case with the ZUGFeRD format. That's how this format works. That means there is a PDF and you can see it as well. And if you then go to certain attachments within it, in Acrobat Reader, you can also see that there is an embedded format, namely the XML structure. And we, as processors, basically have to extract that and then start the invoice workflows accordingly. That was a PDF with embedded XML. The same also exists the other way around. XML with embedded PDF. These are also ways in which you can structure your invoice formats accordingly. Yes, if we take a quick look at that. Recently here in Germany, we've had a wide variety of topics. Especially when it's pure XML, the visualization can sometimes be a bit tricky. Our experience is that you can definitely talk to the providers and ask if it's not possible. Also, whether they offer a standard option to visualize it accordingly. Perhaps also a note regarding Q4-1 and 2, they simply differ in parsing, for example. That means these topics have simply continued to develop accordingly. With XRechnung, there are now two things, or rather two variants. The pure XRechnung UBL, for example, is a pure XML format. And then there is also the UNC fact, which also has certain parsing differences. So if there is an issue, it really comes down to the details, specifically which format the recipient accepts, which format we might need to create, and which formats might come from external sources. We have to define that precisely each time, of course. You are familiar with this. This is now the processing side. Now things are coming into us from the outside. Later, I will also cover the outgoing side when we have to create electronic invoices. This here might be a familiar diagram, which you may already be using in part yourselves. Here, of course, we are not coming in via the scanner, but rather through electronic media via email, or file downloads and so on, which then end up on the scan server through a different channel, of course. As mentioned at the beginning, emails with PDFs are also processed using OCR. But if, for example, we have XML structures, then we need to activate a parsing mechanism. And this specific parsing component, which is then activated within the scan server, is then systematically applied to the various different data formats accordingly. Based on that, the process then continues accordingly in the workflow. Yes, exactly. That would be an introduction for now. So I'd like to switch over now to the list that helps. We can quickly show something there.
Yes, absolutely, sure.
Wonderful. Then I'll switch over to you for a moment. So we also have a different voice. Now it is your turn to step up.
Great, okay. Then I would first suggest that we start again with the input channels. That means, for example, we receive an email. That means the email is now the carrier element for the invoice. This could be a PDF, but it could also be some XML format, a ZUGFeRD invoice, an X invoice, or maybe even a factura invoice. And first of all, we want to show how you can now transfer this email invoice into processing. There are various options or possibilities for this. And to start, for example, you could work with a simple reconciliation program with a basic storage in a file share. That means, for example, we now have an invoice in the inbox, and here we can check again to make sure everything is in order. Did the supplier send us a correct invoice? Did they actually send us an invoice at all? Did they, for example, send it to us in the correct size? And not an unnecessarily large invoice, for example, here as a PDF file, may be created with 24-bit color depth so that we might have XMB per file. That is not the case here, for example. Here we have this invoice with 53 kilowatts, so that's perfectly fine. So we now want to pass this invoice on for processing in this introductory scenario. We can do that very easily, for example, by dragging and dropping it here and placing it in this directory. And this is a directory on our batch processing server. It's basically an input channel for it, and it constantly monitors this directory and then at regular intervals pulls in the files that are located in this directory. If you take a look exactly, we just placed it there and it has already been picked up. That was a PDF invoice, so the corresponding scenario is automatically triggered, and in this case, for a PDF invoice, as mentioned earlier, it is then read out using OCR technology. The invoice relevant data is then recognized accordingly through this process.
So this is a typical entry scenario. For example, if you want to tell your suppliers, please only send us these invoices as PDFs from now on, then you just need a very brief validation phase where you check whether the supplier, for instance, is complying with these requirements. Of course, you will only do this manually here during the initial phase. Using drag and drop, Andy will now show you how it continues.
Exactly. In a further step, it would then be the case that your supplier, for example, sends their invoices to invoicesthecompany.com. And for example, the invoices that arrive in this mailbox are automatically routed through to the VistaScan server. That means the supplier has been qualified, receives this email address, and the invoices are then automatically processed. And I'll just do this manually here one more time. Exactly, and here again, there are several options. We are now going to hand over the entire email for processing, and now you can decide whether you want to process only the invoice and discard the email. Or you can include the entire email as an attachment in the process. This is often relevant as well because the body of the email can frequently contain information that is important for the invoice. And in this way, this information is also available to the approvers.
What he is entering manually here right now will later be automated in your configuration, for example, in Exchange. So when invoices are sent to this central address, like invoice a company, it will automatically be mapped to another address or forwarded using a relay functionality. And then the scan server receives it. This scan server then has various input channels or incoming email addresses, so to speak, to which it responds differently. This is actually a very nice topic because it allows us to map out a whole range of processes. For example, even with PDFs that might be 100 pages long, where only 2 pages are relevant for the invoice, we can also handle that. So please only read these 2 pages or 5 pages, and then that's enough. So there are a lot of customization options. Okay, so.
And now I've logged into the cockpit and set the filter to today's date. Accordingly, we can see the invoices that came in today. And as we just did, we just let 2 invoices run into the system. Here, this first row is the invoice that we transferred into the file shell via drag and drop. And here, this second row is the workflow for the invoice that we forwarded. And now we can already see the first difference directly from the cockpit. Here, an attachment is also available accordingly. And ultimately, this is also the original email, which is now available in the process.
Of course, if we now go into processing, we would naturally identify that it is there twice, just for the sake of completeness. We can, of course, click on it and say, okay, then we get a warning message and can, of course, trigger certain actions. That means, for example, stopping or rejecting the other invoice accordingly. So from this point, you get the notification here, and then you can react to it. Exactly. Please click on cancel again. And for example, the above invoice can simply be set to stop as an example, meaning it can be rejected, for instance, and then it will no longer be considered. That's self-explanatory. But now let's take a look at these other topics, Andy. What do you have there? What were you able to prepare?
Actually, we have an example for all 3 cases, I would say. That means we have a hybrid format, which would be the flagship we mentioned. Then we have the pure XML, which would be, for example, the X invoice here.
Then
we have the partura here, where we ultimately receive two files, one XML and one PDF.
wonderful. So just like in the presentation just now. Let's start with the pure XML. Can we take a look at that to see what it actually looks like?
Exactly. With the X-invoice, there is a special feature that it can ultimately differ again, namely once in UBL and once in UNC-FACT. With UNC-FACT, the syntax, in other words, how the XML invoice is ultimately read, this parsing mechanism is the same as with ZUGFeRD. And yes, we can run both invoice formats through the system in a moment, as I said, or we can take a look at them first. For example, I'll open this XML here, and then we can see the structured data. We can also already see that this is the UBL schema. And what we're doing now is following this X invoice, this UBL X invoice, we go through these structured data and then identify the invoice relevant data. And we also feed those into the workflow.
Exactly. We need to remember that. Now, what happens is that a data stream like this, structured data, ends up with us either via email or by file retrieval, landing in a shared folder accordingly. We can simply simulate this with a basic drag and drop mechanism to show how this invoice comes in. So we take the file and just drop it in accordingly. And now the scan server recognizes this different input channel. And of course, it doesn't activate OCR now, but instead performs XML parsing according to this UBL standard and then reads out all these elements accordingly. We'll take a look at that in the cockpit in just a moment. Let's go a bit further and do another example with the Fatura so we can take a look at the pair there.
Yes.
Just to make it even clearer.
Yes, here we now see a total of 4 files. That ultimately corresponds to 2 invoices. And that means we always have this pair. One is the PDF and the point XML. The .pdf, of course, this is used for visualization. We can take a look at it directly now. This is what such a Fatura invoice looks like. These are sample invoices that we have here. And when we process them, we always have to submit the pair for processing. So I place them here in this file share accordingly. Then the processing begins.
Okay, we'll take a look at that later. That was the second invoice. Now let's take a look at the show piece. Can you go in there to show that embedded object again? So here we see 2 separate objects. With the show piece, we also have an embedded topic.
The show piece also differs in several variants. There is a basic version, a comfort version, and an extended version. That simply depends on how much structured data is ultimately available. That's interesting, for example, when generating an invoice like this. In the meantime, it's also the case that with Showpiece 1 in the basic format, it didn't really prove effective in the end for issuing a fully correct invoice. And with Showpiece 2, that has already changed by now. That means that even in the basic profile, there is now enough structured data available to correctly issue invoices. Let's take a look at an example here, such as a goods invoice from this extended schema, for instance. Let's look it up. As I said, at first glance, this appears to you as just a regular PDF, which again serves for visualization purposes. This is also a more complex invoice with different VAT rates, for example, and discounts as well. And now in this PDF file, there is also an embedded XML file, essentially as an attachment to this PDF. And we can also take a look at that as well.
From the outside, you can't even tell it's a PDF, but only when you, so to speak, open Acrobat and then spot the paperclip, you realize there's another element embedded inside. And that's how it's nested now. So here we basically have an embedded object PDF with embedded XML. Okay, let's drop that in as well, and then we'll head over to our invoice cockpit. So we then need three new invoices to have there. Let's take a look at that right away. Of course, that will take a little bit longer accordingly.
Exactly, the ZUG will come in a moment. I think the other two are already there.
Yes.
Exactly. That was our X invoice, for example. Here we can already see the extracted invoice data. As mentioned, not via OCR this time, but via XML parsing. Shall we go into the editing mode? Let's go in.
So, and that was just the plain XML. And now we'll also see something right away if we don't have this visualization with the plain XML. For example, we have the option to load a standard into the viewer here, which simply says XML invoice. so that you know, over here we have the XML data accordingly. These are the structured data that we have extracted. Of course, this is a completely trivial matter, that's clear. But this would then be replaced if you say for the invoice workflow, even if it's a purely XML invoice, we actually want to have a certain visualization. Then there would still be a certain mechanism there, either from us in the simple case or for more complex topics. You could create a visualization here so that all XML invoices have more or less the same layout and appearance, allowing you to immediately identify that it's an X invoice. Okay, we can stop here. Let's move on to the next one. The data was extracted there. That
is the temperature invoice, where we basically fed the pair into the process. The PDF will be displayed to us here in a moment. We've already taken a look at it here before. Well, I've already run this invoice through the system a few times. That's why we're getting this message here. And this is what it looks like. As I said, here we have the visualization.
So in this case, we are using the visualization directly from the original PDF that is provided to us. But the data on the left side, the extracted and parsed data that comes from the XML. So from this perspective, we immediately have an image of the invoice, and on the other side, we have the structured data. Exactly, and then we'll check if the draft horse has already arrived. But basically, we would have exactly the same situation here. Right now, this is the draft horse case, and this was the PDF with embedded XML where we behave in exactly the same way again. That means we use the PDF for visualization and the XML for the invoice data. Again, here are the notes, invoice line items, and so on. The invoice data is next accordingly. Andy, then we can switch back again. And then it moves into your process, meaning the approval topics and so on. Of course, that's self-evident, but that's not the main focus right now. The main point of today's webinar is simply to show what we actually cover in the area of e-invoicing. Let's move on to the topic of generation. We've been doing this for, well, a relatively short time, about half a year now, with 2 additional partners who are true experts in this field. On one side, there's Epiconsult, and on the other, there's Ecosio. I'll introduce these companies in a moment as well. For example, Epiconsult has now provided enhancements within various SAP environments. Applications, for example, FI or SD invoice documents that are then processed by an ABAP program from EPO. This is a print program, so just like you have printed an invoice in the past with printing and archiving, for example, this is essentially a replacement for that program. And this program generates an XML file based on UBL, which is a standard format that can then be further processed. This XML that is generated also appears in an invoice cockpit, specifically in an outgoing invoice cockpit. And this is also quite interesting. In this outgoing invoice cockpit, you can add additional attachments for the supplier or for the recipient, for example, for the customer or for the authorities. This is a very interesting combination, but underneath it all, the format always remains an XML based on UBL. And now it can basically be sent, so either by email, as we just saw, or as we received it, PayPal. These are the kinds of platforms that are now also being made available in public authorities and the public sector. They are being provided. They also work with things like Lightweg IDs and so on. Sometimes you want to know where the whole thing is supposed to go, or generally via web service, so that we can now send this XML accordingly to our recipients. And now it's also the case that we can do this in very different ways. So on the one hand, this program basically integrates itself as a print program into the SAP world. And we also differentiate between invoices or credit notes and so on. So there are various topics and it looks like this. Invoice, then there's this XML, which is basically the standard that is created. And then something very important happens. Invoice and credit note are saved with it. But then something comes up, for example, this is the outgoing invoice book I just mentioned. But now we can also specify if we have recipient 1, 2, or 3, for example, we can also indicate, take this data stream, this XML UBL, and insert an identifier there. This is an invoice. The second recipient should receive the invoice, but as a ZUGFeRD reference document. The third, for example, should receive it in some other formats. That means you can, for example, suppliers. Ultimately, you can specify for each customer how the customer or the authority actually wants to receive the data from you. You essentially include that information. You include it, so to speak, in this cockpit and in this data stream, in this XML. And then something very important happens. For example, it now goes to an integration hub from Ecosio. This is the second partner we work with. That means this functionality here means I receive something. For example, this XML based on UBL. I receive this standard and it contains my relevant data, such as who is sending it, who it needs to go to, and what it actually is. And there I also have, for example, lightback IDs and so on. And I can also specify in which format I need to map it. That means here as well, the transfer takes place from this incoming XML based on UBL to Faktura to XRechnung to the corresponding ZUGFeRD format. And then it is sent directly to customers or suppliers. Accordingly, it continues from there. This is now the addition to what we have offered so far. On the incoming side, that means we can process incoming documents in a wide variety of formats accordingly and bring them into the process. Here again is the addition. If you also want to focus more on the outgoing side in the future, then we also have a solution here together with these two partner companies so that we can implement the entire mapping and data flows for you in a targeted way for the most diverse use cases. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this is digitalization. This is the world we are increasingly growing into now. Different input formats, different output formats. And a solution provider and the network with ePwn, CoServe, and Hintergrund, that's what we can offer you. But we look forward to hearing from you. Please feel free to reach out to us with any questions. And of course, we are always available for further demo purposes at any time. Thank you very much.